This screencast is going to look at the question Peter Allen from Cost File and Profit Analysis Section 3. So again, as before, have a read through the requirements first, read through the question, and then come back to the screencast. And make sure you make an attempt at each of the requirements before you look at the screencast. Otherwise, you're really defeating the purpose of attempting the questions. So again, we're going to look straight into question part A, part 1, because assuming you've looked down through everything before and taken a read of it. So calculate the number of t-shirts that Peter must make and sell in order to break even in the first year of trading. So again, you should know, go back to your notes from session 3, you should know, so we'll look at A, part 1, the break-even point is your fixed costs over contribution per unit. Okay? So your break-even equals fixed costs over contribution per unit. So the first thing we need to figure out, well, what is our contribution per unit? So our sales price, the student Peter is selling t-shirts, sales price, and this is in euros. Sales price, you're told, is €16 per unit, or per t-shirt. The variable cost, because remember, contribution per unit is sales price less your variable expenses. So contribution, the variable cost per unit is 7, but remember that is excluding sales commission. So always remember, read the question carefully. So that's a -7 because it's the cost for variable. And then you have commission, and you're told the commission is one sales rep gets paid €10,000 along with a 5% sales commission. So it's 5%, so he gets 5% of the 16, which is 80 cents. Therefore you add them up and you get your contribution per unit to be €8.20. Your fixed costs, well, you have to figure out what they are in the question. Your fixed costs are, well, you're told, excluding the sales rep, your fixed costs are 18, so plus 18, and you know your sales rep is essentially a mixed cost. It has a 10,000 fixed element and a 5% variable element. So you're worried about the fixed element here of 10,000, so your fixed costs are 28,000. So now the break-even in units, and again, remember what you're trying to do in English. You know that for every t-shirt you sell, you're going to make a contribution, i.e. over your variable costs, of €8.20. And you want to see, well, how many units do I have to sell to cover my fixed costs of 28,000? So it's 28,000 over 8.2, giving you, and you typically round up in this instance, because you can't have a partial unit, about 3,415 t-shirts need to be sold in order to break even. Okay? So that's A, part 1. You have to figure out, to get break even, you needed the sales price and the variable costs and the fixed costs. So A, part 2 asks you, based on the current level of activity, which you know here is 5,000, prepare a statement of profit and loss showing clearly the revenue, contribution and profit and loss. So again, this is really just, we'll do thousands, revenue, variable costs gets you to contribution, and then you have fixed costs, and once you take away your fixed costs, you come to profit or loss. Alright, so you need to understand how the actual statement of profit and loss looks. It's revenue first, take away your variable cost, adds up here, gets you to your contribution. Then take away your fixed costs, and that will get you to your profit or loss. So how many units? At the current level of activity, we know there's 5,000 units set to we're told here. So the total revenue will be 5,000 units times 16. So 80,000. So we'll just put that in euros instead. The total variable costs will be, well, it's €7 per unit plus, it is, sorry, €7 per unit plus your commission of 80 cents per unit times the number of units, which is 5,000. So you add them up, meaning your contribution is 41,000. And to double check you've that right, you can calculate the contribution per unit. So total contribution over the total number of units means contribution per unit is 8.2, and that agrees with your initial calculation of 8.2. So it's always useful, if you're worried that you're gone wrong somewhere, to double check when you can reconcile your answers. Fixed costs, we already know they're minus 28. Therefore, we know our profit, because our contribution is bigger than fixed costs, is 13,000. Okay? So again, relatively straightforward, as long as you knew the layout of a statement of profit and loss and be able to calculate each line item. So, third question here is, if Peter wishes to earn a profit of 20,000 in the first year, determine the level of sales revenue he must generate. Alright, so that's a tricky one. Determine the level of sales revenue. So the first thing, and this is what's called a target profit analysis. So in this instance, the target required units, we'll work off required units in the first instance, equals, you have your fixed costs plus your target profit over your CPU. So again, remember, there's only the different changes here compared to here, we're just adding in the target profit. And again, from when you think about it intuitively, it makes sense. Instead of just covering the 28,000, we now need to cover the 28,000 plus our target profit. So we need to go over and above that. So in this instance here, the required units are fixed costs, we know, are 28,000. Our target profit in this instance is 20,000. Sorry, 20,000 from the question. And our contribution per unit is 8.2. Meaning, required units are 5,854. But remember, we're not asked for units, we're asked for levels of sales revenue. Therefore, sales revenue is this times the sales revenue per unit, meaning the required sales revenue is 93,659. Okay, so again, what you're seeing here is to break even, you need to sell 3,400. However, to make a 20 grand profit, you need to sell an additional 2,400 to get you up to 5,800 units. So what you're looking at here as well is, the alternative way you could go about this is, you could figure out what the contribution margin is. So your contribution margin here is equal to the contribution over sales price. So that will give you 51.25%. So you can use this instead to go straight from the formula up here to sales revenue. So instead you'll say equals 28,000 plus 20,000 over the contribution margin. And you'll see it gets you back to the same 93,659 sales revenue. So you can use either or. Contribution per unit will get you to number of units. Contribution margin will get you straight to sales revenue. So either one is acceptable. Just make sure you know which one you're comfortable using in the exam setting. And finally, last question is, there's more questions. Without doing any calculations, what is the total contribution at the break-even point? So again, we would have covered this in class, and a lot of students would probably got caught out because it's probably too simplistic that it's thrown them. The total contribution at the break-even point is the same as fixed costs, because if contribution is 28, fixed costs are 28, therefore profit and loss is 0. That is your break-even point. So the total contribution at the break-even point is 28,000. Again, it may seem simplistic, but as we've seen in the class, students can get caught out by overthinking it. Part 5 is calculate the company's expected margin of safety and explain what that means. So again, the margin of safety, or the MOS, is essentially it's actual units minus break-even units, and put all that over actual units. Okay? So since you want to see how far sales can fall before you break even. So in this instance, our actual units are 5,000. minus our break-even units, which are 3,415, over 5,000. That gets you 32%. So the margin of safety in units is 5,000 minus the break-even point. So the margin of safety, i.e. sales can fall by 1,500 units before you break even. Alternatively, sales can fall by 32%, so just looking in relative terms, before the business starts to break even. So again, another useful information, particularly from a manager looking at a sensitivity analysis. How far can a key variable move before we break even? And finally, here's kind of what I call a stretch element. That'll be for 2 or 3 or maybe 4 marks. That'll distinguish, do students actually understand what they're doing, and can they apply this to a practical scenario? So to determine how many units the sales rep needs to sell to justify his appointment. So the question is here, how much does he need to sell to justify an appointment? Well, you know the Peter hired a sales rep on a base salary of 10 grand with a sales commission of 5%. So essentially the question is asking you, how many units does the salesperson, which is a logical question for a manager to ask, particularly a marketing manager, how many units does this person need to sell to justify their appointment? So they have to cover fixed cost is 10,000. Sorry. So the fixed element is 10,000. So, and the contribution per unit is, we already know, 8.2. And that includes their, so we're not ignoring the variable cost, that's included in the 8.2. So that 5% that they get is already included there. So what we're worried about is, if they don't make any sales, they're going to get paid 10 grand because it's a fixed element. So they need to make sales required of 10,000 over 8.2 of 1,200 units, ballpark, 1,220 units, or t-shirts, before they can justify their appointment. So if they don't sell enough in the 1,220, they don't justify their fixed element of the salary. So again, a small part, but it makes you think about what's the difference between fixed and variable costs, and how that relates to a practical scenario such as that. Okay. So the next part we're going looking at now is B. So this relates to the alternative with regards to printing machine. The machine proposal is, instead of leasing a printing machine every year, he could buy time on machine. So essentially you're outsourcing your printing to a pay-as-you-go basis. So it would reduce fixed costs by 8 grand, excluding the sales rep, but would increase variable costs, because again you have now a variable cost, you're changing your cost structure. So compute the break-even point in units and sales revenue, and the margin of safety, if this alternative agreement regarding the printing machine is pursued. So again, same approach as before. What is the sales price? Well, the sales price doesn't really change, it's still 16. The variable cost element, you're told the variable cost element now goes up to 9. So it was before 7, but because you're going as pay-as-you-go, it must be €2 per t-shirt printed, so that's minus 9. Your commission does not change, so you're still paying your 5% commission. Therefore, your contribution per unit now falls to 6.2. Because you have more variable costs in your structure, you have a lower contribution per unit. Your fixed costs, well, you know your fixed costs initially were 28,000, 18 plus 10, but now the 18 has reduced to 8. So now your fixed costs are 8,000 plus the 10,000 for your sales rep. So using those, the break-even point then, which is the first thing you're asked for, is your fixed costs over your contribution per unit. So your break-even point here is 2,903 units, which actually, when you compare to above, is lower. So you now have a lower break-even point, because obviously you reduced a lot of your fixed costs, which obviously reduces your risk. So that's the first part, is you're asked for, in part B, what is the break-even point in units. Now you're also asked for sales revenue. So to calculate its break-even in sales revenue, it will be the number of units, so 2,903 times 16. So the break-even sales revenue amount is 46,452. So moving on then, and you're looking at part, what else you're asked in B part 1, you're asked break-even point in unit sales, and you're also asked in sales revenue and in the margin of safety. So to look at the margin of safety, so margin of safety in units will be the 5,000, which we know is the expected activity already, minus the break-even, which is 2,903. So the margin of safety here is 2,097 units, or 2,097 t-shirts. So that's essentially what we're asked for, is this alternative arrangement. So we can compare the margin of safety in the existing setup, which is, we look at here, 1,500 units. The margin of safety here is actually increased, therefore similar enough to before, the risk has decreased. So we have a bigger margin of safety, a bigger buffer. So that is B part 1. And we're looking at B part 2 then. Asks you to briefly comment on the effect of this alternative cost structure on the break-even level and the profitability of the business. So the point I want you to get at here is, what's essentially happening is that you're changing your cost structure from a fixed cost to a variable cost. So remember we talked about before in terms of outsourcing, you're essentially outsourcing some of your printing costs. You're changing from a fixed lease cost to a pay-as-you-go. So what that does is, it reduces your fixed cost, reduces your break-even. So essentially now you have a lower break-even point, which reduces the risk, but you also have lower profitability when volume increases, because your contribution per unit is now only 6.2 compared to before where it was 8.2. So there is a trade-off between having lower risk, but then you have lower reward for higher volumes. And again, that will be articulated in the sample solution itself. So again, it's only a brief comment on the break-even level, which is reduced, and the profitability of the business, which also is reduced as higher levels of volume go through. The final one then is again what I call a stretch element in the question, which you expect for 4 or 5 marks for students to get, is calculate the level of sales where the business will be indifferent between the current situation, i.e. leasing the machine, and the pay-as-you-go alternative. So essentially what you want to figure out is, well, at what sales level are you indifferent? Okay. So first you have to figure out, well, what's the current situation? The current situation is the CPU is 8.2. So we'll just use it from up here. So the current situation is contribution per unit is 8.2. The contribution margin is, we look up here, contribution margin is 8.2 over 16, which is 51.25%. Alright? So that's the current situation, and the fixed costs, we already know, are 28. So this is a typical one to see, well, actually, at what level of cost are we indifferent? So this will tell you where, well, either or, taking either option of leasing it or pay-as-you-go, it doesn't really make a difference. That will kind of give you useful information to see, well, what level of volume do we have to get to. So that gives you an idea of the current situation, and we'll do the same for the pay-as-you-go. So we call it PAYG situation. And we'll do the exact same in terms of what is your contribution per unit. It has gone down to 6.2 because your variable costs are increased. Your contribution margin is 6.2 over 16, so 38.75. So again, remember what we said before, it's a lower profitability at higher levels, but the fixed costs have also reduced, and they are now only 18,000. So this is where students need to figure out, do you understand how the whole idea of profitability works, and how would you actually understand, well, how would I put this into a problem to solve it? So you want to figure out where the level of sales where the business will be indifferent. So to be indifferent means same level of profitability. Okay? So what you're asking essentially is, what level of sales we call sales equals X. So what level of sales makes these two situations equal to each other? So what you do, and you'll see it in the solution that's put up, it's some type of sales times 0.51 or 51.25% minus your fixed cost, which is 28,000, will equal the same level of sales times 38.75% minus 18,000. So all you're doing is you're figuring out, well, if in the current situation I have this level of sales, I make a contribution of 51.25% and I take off my 28,000 fixed costs. If I do the pay as you go, I only make 38.75 on every percentage sales I sell, but I've also a lower fixed cost. And working that out, you will get your level of sales, which is X, equal to 80,000. Okay, so it essentially says at 80,000 sales, the profit levels are the same for both alternatives, i.e. you would be indifferent. Okay, so a slightly tricky one that you have to get your head around it. Again, it's useful particularly if you're a manager saying, well, at what level of sales? Obviously, once the volumes go up, one is more profitable, this one here, because once you cover that, you're a lot more profitable. For every t-shirt you sell, you're making 8.2, whereas for every t-shirt you sell here, you're making 6.2. So for any level of sales below 80,000, the pay as you go is the more suitable alternative. However, for any situation above 80,000, if you think you're going to make more than 80,000 sales, you should go with the current situation. So again, tricky one, probably for 4 or 5 marks. You can build up some parts of it, but again, I wouldn't be worried about it too much. Focus on the basics of your A and B's, B part 1, B part 2 first, and then worry about the trickier parts. The final part then, part C, that is a more narrative question. Again, you're looking for 10, 15 marks. Explain the term operating leverage using examples of some businesses to illustrate your explanation. And so watch out for that compound requirement. Discuss the impact that automation and outsourcing might have on operating leverage. So again, what I'm looking at here is to explain what actually operating leverage is, why it's important in a business, give examples of types of businesses, be it manufacturing businesses, airlines, hotels, that have different types of operating leverage. So we would have covered this in class. And finally then discuss the impact of both automation and outsourcing and the impact that they would have in a business. So automation, we are switching from direct labor and very labor intensive to automated mechanization of manufacturing. That really will increase your fixed costs, therefore it will increase your operating leverage. The opposite is the same for outsourcing, and the good students will note that it's essentially your machine proposal here is an outsourcing proposal. You're switching from a fixed leasing cost to outsourcing on a pay-as-you-go. And again, we would have discussed in class examples of outsourcing logistics, outsourcing perhaps your sales, and we looked at Concert Co, where you're talking about outsourcing your ticketing proposal. All of those change from a fixed cost structure to a predominantly variable cost structure, i.e. reducing your operating leverage. So again, a nice narrative piece at the end for your talking 10 to 15 marks to cap off the knowledge for CVP analysis. So again, that was a question covering CVP analysis. Peter Allen, session 3.